Okay, we're going to get going. I want to thank you all for coming to the UA Campus Bookstore for this special event. Today's Friday, September 20th, and we have some light refreshments for you, so please take whatever you like. The bookstore closes at 6, so we must be out of here by 6. Okay. This event today is called Michel Butor, the French New Novel and Experiments in Writing with Sudarsan Rangarajan. Excuse the pronunciation. Sudarsan Rangarajan is professor of French in the Department of Languages at UAA. His new book, which he will discuss, is called Critical Essays on Michel Butor's L'emploi du temps, a novel within a novel. L'emploi du temps lends itself to the examination of multiple literary genres, including detective, Gothic, journalistic, narrative, rhetoric, existential, and post-colonial literary theories. It is considered one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. So this is just a fantastic opportunity to learn what's happening in French literature and also to learn more about the French department here at UAA. So please tell me a lot more about yourself and your book, and thank you all for coming. We'll have time for a discussion afterwards. Thank you.
I want to thank Rachel for organizing this event, and thank you all for coming. I want to especially thank the Honorable Consul of Mexico, Javier Abud Osuna, and his wife. My name is Sudarsan Rangarajan. I'm a professor of French in the Department of Languages. I'm from India. I studied French in India. I received a master's in French, and before that I did a lot of things that I don't want to talk about now. I came to this country to do a PhD in French literature. I received my PhD in French from Florida State University in 1995, and I taught at Berry College in Rome, Georgia for 5 years and moved up to Alaska. I always wanted to move up to north, but not this north, but I've been here for 10 years now, and it's been great. And today, my presentation is on Michel Butor, the French New Novel, and Experiments in Writing. I have divided my talk into 3 parts. In the first part, I talk about the new novel in general, comparing it with the traditional novel, and then I give a brief summary of the 8 essays in my book. And then finally, I want to focus on just one essay that would be of interest to everyone. The French New Novel, or the Nouveau Roman, as a concept started in the 1950s. Although one of its exponents, Nathalie Sarraute, wrote and published Tropisme, a collection of short stories, and her first novel, Portrait d'un Inconnu, Portrait of a Man Unknown in 1948. However, as Sarraute herself says, these works did not evoke any interest among the readers at the time of their publication. The new novelists are not a cohesive group. If there is any evidence of cohesion, it is anecdotal. For example, I'm going to show you a picture and that's probably the only time they got together. They were seen together. And these are 2 pictures.
We could take that off. Yes. It's right there. Yeah, we could just take that. Yeah.
And these 2 pictures were taken at the publishers, at the publishing house called Édition de Minuit. And in the picture, you see the authors Alain Robbe-Grillet the self-appointed spokesperson for the new novel, and he has been called the Pope of the new novel. And Claude Simon, the only new novelist to receive the Nobel Prize. And Claude Mauriac, Robert Pinget, Samuel Beckett, whom we all know wrote En attendant Godot, Waiting for Godot, Nathalie Sarraute, Claude Ollier, and Michel Butor. And there are other lists that exclude an author or two from this list, but include others like Jean Carroll and Marguerite Duras. Without quibbling about who is in and who is out, it is safe and fair to say that Butor, Robbe-Grillet, Claude Simon, and Sarraute form the core of the new novel. And they also continue to receive the most critical attention. The new novelists share certain ideas, but they don't form a school with a leader as, say, the Surrealists. Recall that Surrealism was led by André Breton, who published the school's two manifestos in 1924 and 1930, with a well-laid-out theory of what constitutes Surrealist writing. There is no such document for the new novel. At the beginning, readers erroneously thought that the new novelists had a prefabricated theory that they used to write novels. In fact, the theoretical works were published much later, when the novelists started feeling that people, they need to explain what they were doing. Both Sarraute and Robbe-Grillet argued for a new kind of writing, compatible with the evolving relationship between human beings and the world. Robbe-Grillet, in Pour un nouveau roman, or For a New Novel, described the path the novel would take for the rest of the 20th century. So what are the differences between the new novel and the traditional novel, of which Balzac is the poster boy? According to Robbe-Grillet, the notion of characters with a name, age, a profession, and a description of his or her family background is outdated. The protagonist of the 19th century novel is presented to us with a curriculum vitae in hand. Both Balzac and Zola typecasted the characters. In Le Roman Expérimental, the experimental novel, borrowing ideas from the physiologist Dr. Claude Bernard, Zola proposed that novelists, like scientists, should study the effect of environment and heredity on characters. Zola's novels are a systematic study of the Rougon-Macquart family. In fact, Zola provides the genealogy of the characters of the family Rougon-Macquart in the last novel, Le Docteur Pascal. And he wrote a series of 20 novels. And as for Balzac, the characters are typical of a certain section of society with a certain moral value or lack thereof. For example, Vautrin in Old Goriot is representative of criminals, while Madame de Morcerf in Lily in the Valley is the embodiment of virtue. One of the aims of the new novelists is to challenge the readers, draw them out of their comfort zone by not providing everything about the characters all at once. This is the opposite of what we witness in Balzac's novels, where nothing is left for the reader to discover. Balzacian narrators are typical omniscient narrators. And the characters are the puppets of those narrators. Sarraute says that the reader should be in the same position as a writer was when she or he created the characters. Butor also echoes the idea of challenging the reader when he talks about the affinities between l'emploi du temps and the detective novel. Let me add here that in general, new novels have affinities with the detective genre. And I quote here Butor, who says, I suppose that there are people who sleep all day. I want to prevent these people from sleeping. I want to do the opposite of what the detective novel does. End of quote. Robbe-Grillet says that a character in a novel should be neither idiosyncratic nor generic. In his view, the concept of the hero, as we know it, is incompatible with the uncertain world we live in. Sarraute calls the 20th century, quote unquote, the age of suspicion, in which the author and the reader are distrustful of the character and the plot they create. The new novelists were inspired by Kafka, Faulkner, Proust, and Joyce. The protagonist of Kafka's The Trial is quasi-anonymous. He's just called Mr. K. In Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, several characters have the same first name. And as for Proust and Joyce, the revolutionary narrative techniques that they developed served as models for the new novelists. In Robbe-Grillet's La Jalousie, published in 1957, in English, Jealousy, there are three main characters. The anonymous jealous husband, his wife, who is just called A, and Frank, the neighbor with whom she supposedly has an affair. The husband is practically absent, although everything we read comes to us through his eyes. He is like an ambulant cameraman, an observer, whose observations are relayed to the reader by a disembodied voice. It must be noted that jalousie in French also means the window blind through which the husband spies on his wife. The look or the gaze plays an important role in the new novel in general and in La Jalousie. Pertinently, Robbe-Grillet's second novel is titled Le Voyeur. And the new novelists as a group are called L'École du Regard, the school of the gaze. Another characteristic of the traditional novel that Robbe-Grillet criticizes is the well-constructed story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. To write a good story, the writer would put together prefabricated elements according to a well-known formula. Verisimilitude being one of the chief concerns of the traditional novel, the story must reflect reality as closely as possible. The narrator of Old Goriot, Balzac's Old Goriot, reassures the bourgeois reader that the story she is about to read is neither a fiction nor a novel, for, I quote, all is true. And he wrote these words in English, all is true. And the narrator of Stendhal's Le Rouge et le Noir, The Red and the Black, says that, I quote, a novel is a mirror carried along a highway, end of quote. In the 19th century, the writer aimed to reassure, not unsettle the readers. There is nothing more reassuring and familiar than the third-person narration of a story in a linear, chronologically organized manner in the simple past, passé simple, a literary tense ubiquitous in the novels up until the mid-20th century. Critics, for their part, would often begin with a summary of the plot, note the flaws, if any, in the structure, and praise the way the story is told. They would write something like, it's moving or captivating. Robbe-Grillet affirms that in the new novel, narrative is freely invented, and writing is one of its subjects. Jean Ricardou perhaps put it most succinctly. The new novel is not about, I quote, writing an adventure, but an adventure of writing, end of quote. The protagonists of new novels are often themselves writers. And the novels are either about another novel or a novel within a novel. The narrator of Butor's L'emploi du temps writes his journal, and in his diary, he writes about another novel titled The Blessed Murder. Sarraud's Les Fruits d'Or, The Golden Fruits, is about critics discussing a novel with the same title. All the characters being anonymous in this novel, the only way to identify them is by closely following their conversations and or thoughts. A narrative within a narrative, or narrative embedding, is a technique called mise en abîme. Simply put, when there is a mirror image within an image, there is mise en abîme. The technique is exemplified in art, and here I want to show. Okay, and slideshow. Okay. And this is a 15th century painting. The exact date is 1434. It's by a Dutch painter whose name is Jan van Eyck. And the painting is called the Arnolfini Wedding. And this is a typical example of la mise en abîme. Here we see the couple, and in the background we see a mirror, and with a reflection of the couple. So image inside an image. And there is, let me see. Okay. Here's another painting, Las Meninas, the Maids of Honor, dated 1656. It's by Diego Velázquez, and it's another example of the mise en abîme. Here we have the self-portrait of Velázquez painting within a painting. He is in the process of painting another painting. And in the background, we see a mirror. And in the mirror, we see the King Philip VI of Spain and the Queen Mariana. Now, is that a reflection of what is in the painting that Velázquez is painting? Or is it a reflection of the king and the queen sitting while Velázquez is painting that portrait? And what about the man at the door in the background? Is he entering the room or is he leaving? This painting has been interpreted in different ways, and it's a very good example of indeterminacy, a characteristic of the new novel. As a contemporary and popular example, I have a copy of an album of Pink Floyd. A student gave this to me. It's a very good example of mise en abîme as we see in the new novel. What is interesting about this picture is that the copies, the image within the image, the different images, they are all different. They are not same. They are variations. And this is exactly what happens in a new novel. And the album is called Amagama. As a literary phenomenon, embedding is not new, as many Shakespeare's plays demonstrate. Actually, it was Victor Hugo in the 19th century who noted that 34 of Shakespeare's 36 plays use the mise en abîme technique. And André Gide used it in his novel Les Faux Monnayeurs, The Counterfeiters, published in 1926. In Gide's novel, a novelist writes a novel of the same title. But the new novel made mise en abîme a distinct and pervasive feature. So, what are the different functions of mise en abîme in the new novel? First, any mise en abîme is a repetition. By repeating an event or an action that has been narrated, the novel highlights it. It does not merely repeat it, but does so in condensed form, as a mini narrative, so to speak. At times, the micro events act as precursors of macro events in the story. And at other times, they may subvert the main narrative, or they may partially resemble each other. And all this results in indeterminacy. The first and the last chapters of Robespierre's Jealousy begin with the words, I quote, now the shadow of the column. And 4 of the 8 chapters begin with the word now, marking the temporal ambiguity of the perennial present, which makes it impossible to establish the chronology of certain events in the novel. In Butor's L'emploi du temps, there are many examples of mise en abîme, some explicit and some subtle. The most obvious example is the detective novel Blesston Murder that the narrator writes about in his diary. The protagonist of L'emploi du temps is not a detective by profession, but assumes the role of an amateur detective. After a chance meeting with the author of Blesston Murder, George Hamilton, Revel gets entangled with real-life events that he believes are the source of the plot in the novel. Revel would later discover the author's real name, George William Burton, and Revel divulges Burton's true identity, which the author had asked him to keep a secret. And Revel believes that his betrayal may have caused the hit-and-run car accident in which the author is severely hurt. Although Revel's investigation of the suspects leads him nowhere, he resembles Oedipus, the prototype of the detective. Oedipus, as we all know, he killed his father and solved a riddle. In a certain sense, Burton is Revel's father, for Revel's diary would not exist without Burton's novel. Further, as a writer, Revel competes with Burton. Burton affirms that in a detective novel, there are 2 timelines. I quote, the days of the inquiry that started the crime and the days of the drama that lead up to it. End of quote. In his diary, although Revel initially follows 2 timelines, he expands them to 5. Figuratively speaking, this may be interpreted as Revel's attempt to replace his father. There are other signs that point to his usurpation. For example, after initially using Blesston Murder as a guide to explore the city of Blesston, Revel declares that his own knowledge of the city being sufficient, he doesn't need the novel anymore. Another example of mise en abîme in the news is the newspaper. L'emploi du temps is a journal intime, or a diary novel, and the word journal in French means both diary and newspaper. Jacques Rebel regularly reads and cites newspapers. Newspaper articles are embedded in the novel. As I have demonstrated in the 3rd essay in my book, the newspaper and the novel share many characteristics as genre. And in L'emploi du temps, journalistic discourse permeates the narrator's own discourse. The most interesting mise en abîme in L'emploi du temps involves artifacts. The tapestries in the Blesston Museum and the stained glass windows in the old cathedral. The tapestries represent the myth of the Greek hero Theseus, and the stained glass windows, the biblical story of Abel and Cain. Jacques Revel repeatedly visits the museum and the cathedral to contemplate them and establishes interrelationships between the two sets of artifacts on the one hand and between himself and Theseus and Cain on the other. Until the advent of the new novel, the story or the content received the most attention to the neglect of form. What would happen if the form of a novel, the way it is narrated is changed? Imagine the story of Madame Bovary told in the first person. It wouldn't be the same novel as we all know. Who would be the narrator? Emma and Charles are ruled out because both die. Would it be one of Emma's lovers, the infatuated and immature Léon, or the playboy Rodolphe, or the glib pharmacist Homais? But there is no sanctity about keeping all the elements of Flaubert's novel. And in any case, we would have a different novel. I took Madame Bovary as an example, not only because it is considered the first, arguably the first modern French novel, but also Bovarism is a recurring theme in world literature. I would like to mention just two novels that are rewrites of Madame Bovary. Kate Chopin's The Awakening, published in 1899, and the French-Canadian author André Langevin's Poussière sur la ville, Dust in the City, published in 1953. Langevin's Dust in the City closely resembles Madame Bovary, but it's a first-person novel narrated by the husband, Alain Dubois, who is a competent doctor as opposed to the much ridiculed Charles Bovary. Recall the opening scene of Flaubert's novel, where Charles appears as a bumbling idiot mumbling his own name in front of his classmates. Unlike Charles, who remains in the dark about Emma's affairs until her death, Alain Dubois is fully aware of his wife Madeleine's relationship with Richard Etieux. Dubois is an ambiguous character, at times confronting Madeleine and at others giving her the freedom she seeks. Besides the change in the narrative perspective, the other big change in Langevin's novel is that Madeleine commits suicide by shooting herself after shooting Richard. Beyond the similarity of the plots with some changes, what is interesting about this French-Canadian novel is how the overarching existential theme of absurd is presented. From Langevin's novel, it is evident that it is not, after all, the husband's ignorance and blindness that contributed to the wife's moral decline and death. The absurd, exemplified by Albert Camus' L'étranger, the stranger, is the gap between what we desire and what the world has to offer. Neither the human being nor the world is absurd, but it's the alienation that results from the interaction between the two. Langevin's novel underscores this point by casting the city as one of the main characters. So after this digression, let me go back to the new novel, in which the form, the way a narrative is told, is given predominance over the content. In many a new novel, whether it is Robbe-Grier's, Butor's, or Sarraud's, narrative qua narrative occupies a prominent place. Stories are often banal, but the way they are narrated is what makes them interesting. For example, the story of Butor's La Modification, A Change of Heart, published in 1957, is all too familiar. The protagonist, Léon Delmont, a Parisian in his mid-40s, married with children, contemplates leaving his wife Henriette, to settle with his mistress, Cécile d'Arcelat, in Rome. A salesman for a typewriter company in Rome, Delmo often travels to Rome by train. The entire narrative takes place in a train, and it's about his quote unquote definitive trip to Rome to tell his mistress that he wants to be with her. Butor, for whom, I quote, the novel is a laboratory of the narrative, I would say a laboratory of narrative pronouns, wrote the novel in the formal second person pronoun vous. What are the instances when the pronoun vous is used? Obviously, we use vous to address someone we don't know or to show respect to someone. That's the basic usage. Vous is also used in special circumstances, such as when an award, say the Nobel Prize, is conferred on someone. The presenter would say something like, you wrote your first novel in such and such year, you received such and such award, etc., etc. Yet another instance, one that is pertinent to Butor's novel, is the interrogation by the police. When the suspect in a case doesn't want to talk, the interrogator, using the information collected from witnesses, would say something like, at 11 p.m. you went to the bar where you met with Mr. X, and at midnight you drove to Miss Y's house, etc., etc. So more broadly speaking, in a novel, the second person pronoun may be used when a character is unable or does not want to tell the story. The character becomes the narratee, the person to whom the story is narrated. In A Change of Heart, Léon Delmont is in such a situation. He is on a secretive trip. His wife doesn't know the true purpose of his trip, and his mistress is unaware that he is coming to visit her. And of course, Delmont hasn't told his employer about it. Throughout the 24-hour journey, he is agitated by a feeling of guilt and a feeling of uncertainty. The narrative voice that addresses him uses vous, that uses vous has several functions, at times supporting his plan, at other times bringing out the cons. Eventually, he is brought to realize that his plan is not feasible, that he should stay with his wife. He is also made to realize that he is drawn to Rome not because of his mistress, but because he loves the city. The second person narrative technique helps the character attain self-awareness. Upon arrival in Rome, Delmont will not visit his mistress. Instead, he will return to Paris and decide to write a book similar to the one that he has been holding in his hands but has not read. Writing as a form of salvation is yet another characteristic of the new novel. Now, having noted the common ground shared by the new novelists, I would like to briefly talk about how they are different. The differences can be clearly seen in the writings of Robbe-Grillet, Butor, and Sarraute. As Roland Barthes noted in his essay, the title of the essay is Il n'y a pas d'école Robbe-Grillet. There is no school called Robbe-Grillet School. And he wrote that Butor and Robbe-Grillet are two totally different writers. Robbe-Grillet rejects the psychology behind actions. And for him, objects don't have any significance. He is particularly opposed to anthropomorphism, that is, the attribution of human characteristics to animals and inanimate objects, which was most commonly practiced by the Romanticists in the 19th century. Think of Lamartine's poem Le Lac, the lake, in which the lake is the witness to the relationship between the poet and his mistress. Now, instead of assigning symbolic roles to nature, or for that matter, any object, to evoke an emotion, Robbe-Grillet resorts to what T.S. Eliot calls the objective correlative. According to Eliot, to express emotion in art, the artist needs to find, I quote, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula for that particular emotion. End of quote. In Robbe-Grier's Jealousy, the killing of the centipede by Frank and the stain it leaves on the wall act as objective correlatives to the husband's jealousy. While the centipede itself is devoid of any symbolism in the novel, the obsessive repetition of the scene in the novel is a way of expressing the husband's emotion. For Robbe-Grier, objects are not symbols, they are just there. In order to treat objects as objects, to bear them, he eschews metaphors and resorts to meticulous geometrical descriptions. Witness, for example, the beginning of Jealousy. I quote, "Now the shadow of the column which supports the southwest corner of the roof, divides the corresponding corner of the veranda into two equal parts. The veranda is a wide covered gallery surrounding the house on three sides. Since its width is the same for the central portion as for the sides, the line of shadow cast by the column extends precisely to the corner of the house." End of quote. I must say that Robbe-Grier studied engineering. As opposed to Robbe-Grier, who attempts to rid the world of signification, Butor invests them with it. There are objective correlatives in Butor's novels also, such as the recurrent fires in L'Emploi du Temps. But symbols and metaphors also abound. Whereas myths are subverted in Robbe-Grier's works, Butor uses them in innovative ways, such as the representation of the city in L'Emploi du Temps as both the labyrinth and the monster that resides in it. In an interview to Magazine Littéraire, Butor says, I quote, "Mes livres sont des fils d'Ariane pour tenter de clarifier le labyrinthe." End of quote. My books are Ariadne's threads that attempt to clarify the labyrinth. Butor also believes that psychology is fundamental to any story. The train trip in La Modification evoked earlier plays a critical role in the protagonist's psychological journey to attain self-awareness. And in L'Emploi du Temps, Jacques Revel's apprehensions and fears vis-à-vis the city of Bleston are psychological. And as for Sarraute, she says, when she read Proust, she discovered the mental world. She is interested in psychoanalysis, but of a particular type, one that allows her to scrutinize the subconscious. She goes beyond the traditional dialogue and the interior monologue and investigates what she calls, I quote unquote, les mouvements souterrains, the underground movements. She calls these evanescent movements tropisms, a term she borrows from biology. And she defines it as, I quote, interior movements that precede and prepare our words and actions at the limits of our consciousness. End of quote. For Sarraute, the subconscious is the stage where all the drama takes place, and it consists of attacks, victories, defeats, murders, and everything. In her novels, Sarraute brings to light these dramas in the form of sous-conversation or sub-conversations between characters or a character and an imaginary person. So tropisms and sub-conversations are the basis of the entire work by Sarraute. Let me now turn to the book, Critical Essays on Michel Butor's L'Emploi du Temps. And let's see here. So here's a table of contents, and there are 8 essays. So I would like to talk about the first essay titled "Narrative and Other Beginnings" in detail after uh, I give a brief summary of the other essays. I wanted to talk about narrative and other beginnings because I thought that it's a topic that relates to all novels and would be of interest to everyone. So, but first, let me give a summary of the other essays. The second essay, Narratives as générateurs de récits, is about 3 characters whom Jacques Revel addresses: the Bailey sisters, Anne and Rose, and the city of Bleston. And as in any work of fiction, there is an anonymous narratee in the novel. I show how these narratees directly or indirectly function as generative forces in the novel. It is because of them that Jacques Revel writes his diary. In the third essay, about which I have briefly talked about, I discussed the 3 elements of journalistic discourse: faits divers, features, and interviews. Faits divers are stories about murders, thefts, fires, or anything unusual. Most stories that we see on TV, right, are faits divers. In the essay, I show how the narrator uses the techniques of and writes like a journalist. In the fourth essay, I discuss the interrelationship between collections and recollections or memory. I talk about place memory. And according to Michel Foucault, a heterotopia, I talk about heterotopia. A heterotopia is the opposite of utopia. It's a place where heterogeneous objects are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. In L'Emploi du Temps, the city of Bleston, the museums and monuments are heterotopias. In the fifth essay, I examine the narrator's lies and how he tries to absolve himself of them. One strategy that he uses is qui s'excuse s'accuse, or the opposite. Qui s'accuse s'excuse. Normally we say that someone who makes an excuse accuses himself, but here what he does is he first accuses himself, and that way he can excuse himself. In the sixth essay, I show how the novel combines the detective and the Gothic genre, 2 genres that are antithetical. As an amateur detective, Revel uses pseudoscientific arguments, and when they fail, he resorts to explanations using supernatural phenomena, in which Bleston, the city of Bleston, like any industrial city, appears as a monster. And the result is a parody of the 2 genres. The seventh essay looks at the protagonist as a flaneur, someone who walks around the city and who is in a privileged position to see the city both from inside and outside. He perceives the city as an existential being. The last essay is mainly about the way the African character Horace Buck is treated in the novel. Although the protagonist, Jacques Revel, criticizes the racism of his friend Lucien Blaise and his colleague James Jenkins vis-a-vis Horace Buck, he doesn't realize that his own behavior toward Buck is ambiguous. One possible explanation is that, as most first-person narrators, while he sees flaws in others, he does not completely understand his own flaws. Now, I would like to talk a little bit in detail about the first essay about beginnings, narrative and other beginnings. Beginnings of great works of fiction often suffice to evoke the titles in the reader's mind. The lines, I quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," immediately recalls A Tale of Two Cities. Many a reader of French literature would recognize the opening lines of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Longtemps je me suis couché de bonne heure. For a long time I went to bed early. And everyone is familiar with the morbid beginning of The Stranger. Aujourd'hui, maman est morte, ou peut-être hier, je ne sais pas. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. L'emploi du temps draws the reader's attention to the importance of narrative beginnings in a reflexive way. When the narrator, referring to the detective novel Blessed and Murder, says, I quote, "I can almost say that a new phase of my adventure began at the instant when I read for the first time these opening words which I know now by heart." End of quote. Further, when Rebel's friend and colleague James Jenkins, who, while claiming that he has not read Blessed and Murder, unconsciously paraphrases the novel's first line and underscores the fact that one may forget a novel's plot but not its beginning. The significance of fictional beginnings, however, lies beyond the mere recollection of the work's titles. The first line or page of a narrative represents but one type of beginning. According to Catherine Romagnolo, there are two types of beginnings, formal and conceptual. Formal beginnings include chronological beginning, discursive beginning, and causal beginning. Chronological beginning is the beginning of the story. Discursive beginning is the beginning of a text, a chapter, a part, etc. And causal beginning is the beginning of the plot. L'emploi du temps illustrates these different forms of beginnings. When we start reading the novel, on top of the first page, two dates that are 7 months apart, May 1st and October 1st, appear. After reading a few pages, we understand the significance of the two dates. October 1st is the date Revel arrives in Bleston. This is the chronological beginning. And May 1st is when he starts writing the diary. This is the discursive beginning. Because of the initial 7-month gap between the time that the events take place and the time that he starts narrating them, the narrator will be playing catch up throughout his 1 year stay in Bleston. While he has a clear memory of the events of the first week of his stay in Bleston, he has to dig deep like an archaeologist to narrate what happened in the remainder of the 7 months. In any novel, there are multiple discursive beginnings because each section, each part of the novel represents a new beginning. Further, in a diary novel, each entry is a new beginning. Let's look at some of these beginnings in L'Emploi du Temps. The novel consists of 5 parts and each part comprises 5 sections. But for a few exceptions, all the parts begin on the first day of the month and the sections on the first day of the week, which for the French is Monday. The first part of the novel is appropriately titled L'Entrée, in English, First Steps. I like the French title because it also connotes the reader's entry into the fictional world of the novel. The second part is titled Les Présages, Portents, which marks a new beginning because portent means what is about to happen. The beginning of this part illustrates the difference between chronological beginning and discursive beginning. The narration of the past is interrupted by a more pressing current event. and the narrator is forced to effect a change of chronology. Part 3, titled L'accident, the accident, opens with yet another change in chronology. There is a symmetry in the beginnings of parts 2 and 3. Both begin with the narrator's confession of his disclosure of Burton's real name on two different occasions. First to his friend and colleague James Jenkins, and to the Bailey sisters Anne and Rose. Part 4, Les Deux Sœurs, the two sisters, and Part 5, Adieu, Farewell, resemble each other in that each begin after an emotional interruption. Part 4 begins after Rose Bailey's engagement to Rebel's compatriot and friend Lucien Blaise, just as Part 5 begins with after Anne Bailey's engagement to his friend and colleague James Jenkins. Rebel had been secretly in love with the two sisters, so the two engagements deeply affect him. In addition to these clearly identifiable discursive beginnings, there are others that are noteworthy. Repetition, which abounds in L'emploi du temps, connotes a new beginning. According to Edward Said's, I quote, "Beginning is basically an activity which ultimately implies return and repetition rather than simple linear accomplishment," end of quote. We all know the basic rule from the essays we wrote in high school and college: the conclusion repeats the introduction. Pertinently, the opening and concluding scenes of L'emploi du temps are mirror reflections. Rebel arrives in Bleston by train on a rainy day, and he leaves the city after 1 year by train on a rainy day. The third type of beginning, the causal beginning, is the beginning of the plot. According to Romagnolo, I quote, "Causal beginnings are catalytic narrative moments," end of quote. Determining a narrative's causal beginning is problematic because its identification, I quote, is subject to reader interpretation. In Brian Richardson's view, I quote, "We need to critically sift the various possibilities until we arrive at the first significant event of the story. Our most accurate concept will be an avowedly shifting one, and one that thereby points to the elusive and often arbitrary nature of beginnings," end of quote. This notion especially applies to novels such as L'emploi du temps, which follow multiple timelines. According to Gerald Prince, the beginning is, I quote, "the incident initiating the process of change in a plot or action. The incident does not necessarily follow, but is followed by other incidents," end of quote. On this view, it may be argued that Rebel's purchase and reading of the detective novel Bleston Murder about 4 weeks after his arrival in Bleston, which bring about the first fundamental change in his life in Bleston, and he says, Rebel says, "A new phase of my adventure began at the instant," end of quote. So that's what represents a possible beginning of L'emploi du temps. Further, the symbiotic relationship between Bleston Murder and Rebel's diary implies the former is the source of the latter. J. Hillis Miller writes, I quote, "The paradox of beginning is that one must have something solidly present and pre-existent, some generative source or authority on which the development of a new story may be based," end of quote. In L'emploi du temps, this is true both at the intertextual level, because Proust's remembrance of things past is one of the possible sources, and at the intratextual level. For Rebel considers Bleston Murder, at least initially, as an authoritative guide to Bleston. For Peter Brooks, quote-unquote, "narrative desire impels all stories." As Rebel avers, such a desire arose in him on Tuesday, April 29th. It is on that day that he realizes that the burning of the map of Bleston the Sunday before was an insensitive act, and he decides to write his journal. He would then buy the paper to write his journal on April 30th and actually start writing on May 1st. According to James Phelan, the beginning is, I quote, that which generates the progression of the narrative by introducing unstable relationships between characters, and he calls them instabilities, or between the narrator and reader, tensions. In L'Emploi du Temps, Revel's disclosure of Burton's name to the Bailey sisters fits this definition. The tension increases as the reader learns later in the narrative that the narrator had divulged the detective novelist's name to James Jenkins the day before he did to the Bailey sisters. So far, I have talked about the various types of formal beginnings. In addition to these, there are conceptual beginnings, and they concern themes. When one starts reading a novel, one enters a story world, a term David Herman uses to, I quote, suggest something of the world-creating power of narrative, its ability to transport interpreters from the here and now of face-to-face interaction or space-time coordinates of an encounter with a printed text or a cinematic narrative to the here and now that constitute the deictic center of the world being told about. End of quote. According to Phelan, entrance is the reader's multi-leveled cognitive, emotive, ethical movement from outside the text to a specific location in the authorial audience. Butor's first novel, Passage de Milan, begins with the priest Jean Ralon's view of Paris from his window as the night falls, and marks the narrative transition from the real world to the fictional world when the priest closes the window and turns on the light. La Modification opens with the protagonist's entrance into a train compartment where the entire story is told. Butor's fourth novel, Degrees, begins with the narrator-teacher Pierre Bernier's entrance into the classroom. Similarly, the story of L'Emploi du Temps unfolds with Revel's arrival in or entrance into Bleston. The problematic of beginning in this novel is underscored by the fact that Revel is unable to enter the city proper the night of his arrival. He leaves the train station where his train arrived, takes a cab, but is unable to indicate to the driver the hotel where a room has been reserved because he cannot find the letter from his employer. Eventually, he ends up spending the night at the waiting room of another train station. Awakening or arousal is another common fictional theme that signals a beginning. From Proust, we all know the interconnections between sleep, awakening, and memory. For Proust, sleeping is akin to traveling in space and time, and awakening offers the narrator the potential to regain lost memories. In L'Emploi du Temps, the narrator often struggles to be awake and write his journal as he tries to recuperate his past. The first sentence of L'Emploi du Temps, Les lueurs se sont multipliées, suddenly there were a lot of lights, describe the narrator's awakening in the train upon arrival in Bleston. The adjective multiplier in French alerts the reader to the novel's multiple beginnings. In fact, Revel begins the second and third sections of his diary with a description of his awakening and underscores it as a narrative theme. The name Revel evokes the verbs révéler, to reveal, but also se relever, to get up or arise. and se réveiller, to wake up. And the narrator uses these verbs both literally and metaphorically to indicate regaining awareness after being shaken or lost. One of the most notable such instances occurs outside the old cathedral, where Revel falls and gets up after colliding with a young woman whom he later identifies as Rose Bailey. It is to redeem his image and impress Rose Bailey after this embarrassing incident that he reveals Burden's real name to the Bailey sisters, and the indiscretion sends him on a guilt trip throughout his stay in Bleston. Now, let me conclude with a remark on the ending of L'Emploi du Temps. The ending is interesting in that the narrator does not have the time to finish writing his journal. Before he finishes, it's time for the train to depart. Among the many events he has not narrated are the events that happened on February 29th. In L'Emploi du Temps, beginnings are numerous and there is no definitive ending. Butor's novel is a work in progress. Writings are drafts in the sense that Montaigne conceived of his essays. As you know, the word essay is derived from essayer, to try. Thank you very much. Yes.
This novel, the one that you're featuring today, is it available? I tried to find it here in the bookstore. I couldn't find it yesterday, and also went to Barnes and Noble, and wasn't able to locate it there.
The novel is available in French for sure.
But is it in English available?
In English, I don't know. I myself bought this copy in a flea market.